Now, those three meta-trends things are something in a very small way I'm trying to take advantage of. We're trying to take advantage of. Matt here over here is a part of the team here. We're basically trying to take about this new company, Reinventors. And given that you're kind of a business crew, I want to give you just one little look here that fits into this larger frame of what's going on with Reinvention of one small startup that's kind of trying to take one little whack at this thing and trying to take advantage of these technologies to make one little effort, essentially knocking this thing down. And that's this company, Reinventors, and we're basically starting out with a project, appropriately enough to reinvent America, starting this fall. We're basically going to be launching. We just incorporated. We're going to launch after the elections, and I'll tell you a little bit about this company. So the first thing is we're assuming, after I just laid out this, that the world is going through this really rare historic transformation. And we're assuming that essentially America is going to go through a fundamental reinvention. It certainly has to do that, but we're saying it's in fact in the beginning stages of doing that. And we're assuming that this isn't just a thing about America. This is happening all over the world. This is the people in Greece kind of trying to figure out how to, the euro problem. I mean, all these systems of the 20th century are breaking down. You name it, it's happening. Middle East, Europe, China, it's all not working. So we go, okay, we're taking that as a given. We're also taking it as like, for whatever reason, we can analyze this, that conversation that we really need isn't happening in our politics now. There's all these reasons for it. You can't make a misstep. There's every little news cycle, and you alienate these people, and you get hit by this and that. Anyhow, I'm just not going to blame it on an individual or anything. It's like our politics is the point where you cannot talk about that kind of level of innovation, that kind of level of kind of fundamental reinvention. Okay. We also think to have this conversation, you need to have the best innovators, the smartest people who understand technologies, they understand these fields of the future, they understand where the world's going. We want them to help us figure out how to reinvent these systems. We don't want some guy in a think tank. He's been in for 30 years in Washington. He's been talking to these politicians. Everything's cautious. Everything's kind of, it's something he learned at, Brookings Institute 30 years ago. Whatever. That's not who you want in this conversation. We need to get the folks that are essentially inventing the future anyhow. How to get them in this conversation. Well, we think essentially, and we also want to take advantage of why wouldn't we take advantage of this group video capability. The thing I just talked to you about, this powerful new capability, clearly on a trend to expand more. How can we take advantage of that thing to do this? And so what we're essentially doing with this project is we're creating that conversation, that missing conversation on how do we fundamentally reinvent America. We're connecting up those remarkable kind of reinventors, people, the kind of folks that understand tech, fields of the future, getting them to talk about this thing, and we're going to do it over this interactive group video. And that, in essence, is just the three things we're going to pull off. And we're going to do it starting this fall in this little pilot project. Now, in a practical way, how this would work is essentially, this is Michael Pollan, for folks that know him, one of the great thinkers on food. This is the kind of guy we're talking about as a reinventor. This is a guy who he's not sitting in Washington. He's not at the Brookings Institute. But if there's a guy who understands what do we need to do to fundamentally reinvent agriculture, how to fundamentally reinvent food production, and has some big ideas on how you'd actually pull that off or think about that in the next 20 years, we're going to have a guy like that anchor, essentially. Every part of our series is going to have an anchor reinventor like Michael. And we're going to ask him straight up, Michael, knowing what you know about this space, don't have to have the finished, polished idea. Throw out a big idea or two on how would you basically start to reinvent this space. Don't think about the constraints of politics and how you get it through politics, you get it voted on, or how you get it through committee or all that kind of stuff. Don't worry about if it's going to alienate the kind of ideology of one side or the other, that kind of thing. Just say, how do you know the 21st century is going to work, and what's your best shot at how we'd reinvent that system? In fact, that's going to start these things. This is a mock-up, by the way. This is not the way it's going to look, but that's me kind of driving that conversation. But what we're going to do is take advantage of this roundtable situation, this group video. And so this is a guy named John Battelle. You probably remember John, was one of the founding managing editor of Wired Magazine, did the Web 2.0 conference that was really helped spread the idea of Web 2.0. Brilliant guy, interesting guy, knows a ton about media. Would love to have John help reinvent privacy. Okay? SOPA and all these different attempts that DC is trying to do about protecting intellectual property or privacy amongst people, that ain't working, right? Why don't we get the folks that understand the digital world, understand what it needs to do, and help them kind of reinvent, redesign these kind of new systems. So anyhow, this is an example of a guy who would essentially anchor that. And this is that Saul Griffith I was talking to you about, the innovator who came up with a lot of that other stuff. All three of these folks, by the way, are people we've approached. All three of those people said they'd get involved. This is the kind of caliber of folks that we want to start getting to start to spike that conversation. But as we build in this roundtable, it's not just that Pollen's idea or Batel's idea. It's like riff off other experts, riff off other people, innovators. Get these conversations moving through this group video, streaming it to live audiences, archiving it on the web through YouTube, actually. And ultimately, then the audience can build off those kind of catalytic conversations. And questions that emerge or things that emerge out of these initial conversations, we can actually have folks in the audience start to kind of build on those questions, answer those questions, participate in other kind of ways. There's a way that we get essentially, because it's not just the rock stars, and it's not just these kind of roundtable folks, the few people you can squeeze in for 10 people on a seat there, but ultimately we think there's a lot of people who contribute to this kind of reinvention. And ultimately, knowing the web now and how it actually moves, we've got a bunch of ideas of how to actually get these ideas out and certainly get it into the slots like in DC and other places, that they can keep an eye on these real reinventors and these real fresh new ideas on how to do these things. We've got a bunch of folks. I mentioned to you some of the folks we got here. You might recognize some of them. A lot of them are in the Bay Area. A lot of the folks that you're probably familiar with. But they're folks that essentially haven't had that kind of, don't have that access to DC, aren't being asked what they do, and are essentially not applying their brains to civic innovation. And we think that this would be one avenue to do it, and we're actually finding as we reach out to these folks, they're more than happy to do it. They love to do it. They got kids. They got legacies. They want to basically help solve the problem. And we're finding a really great response from them. Your business crew, so I want to say we always got to think, and I've started other businesses too, how are you going to make this? How are you going to sustain this? Without going into super details here, we've thought a lot about this. And we've thought about, besides getting initial investment from the Valley, which we do have now, we've got one of the early guys from Facebook has essentially just put money into our company, so it's catalyzing the initial kind of investment. And so we are in the game, we're going from an investment point of view, but it's actually how do you sustain this thing? And what we basically think is that that this conversation is a valuable conversation. And this access to these kind of folks is something that people would be really interested in being a part of. And so we do think amongst the roundtable of 10 people that would be in these conversations, we'd reserve a couple slots for sponsors. And we've already talked to a certain number of folks from companies and kind of high net worth folks that even do it, but particularly companies who would like to be associated with that kind of innovation, but also would like that kind of access to this conversation and like to be in on that table, seat at the table, and we're finding out people actually do that. Now, if you do it that way, if we can crack this model of catalyzing these conversations, bringing this kind of things to spark these kind of early thinking around these kind of reinventions, we think it actually could actually scale up. Because if you could get sponsors doing, if you can start to get conversations around reinventing America across all these fields, you could start doing it in Europe. We're already starting to talk to a person in Europe who could actually anchor one of those. If you could go into different areas, you could reinvent education, you could reinvent kind of energy. So basically what we're doing, think of it as a media show catalyzed around this basic framework of reinvention, kind of catalyzing the conversation, building up the network, and essentially creating a media product that hopefully will spark a lot of new thinking in these spaces.